Thank you for joining us. The big topic of today, this is a wild one because it continues to be a thorn in my side, is what does it mean when you say turnkey? We all think we know what that means, but when I looked it up on the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says something along the lines of turnkey refers to something that is ready for immediate use, generally used in the sale or supply of goods or services. Is that what you guys thought it meant? I always kind of assumed turnkey meant everything's included, but really it doesn't necessarily mean that. It means that it's ready to be used. I think that's an interesting distinction. It may not change much, but it kind of leads to the whole point of maybe we need to do a better job of defining this stuff. And so this is kind of drawn from an issue that I'm experiencing with a closing currently. It's a little ugly, and I've had it before. So I think I've talked on this class before that I had a deal where the buyer's husband, goes and does an inspection or does a walkthrough when they first see the property. It's listed on the market. They haven't made an offer. They go in and see it. And his wife is back at home. She's not available. So she couldn't come for this. But he calls her after that and says, look, honey, this is a great place. We're really excited. It's the golfing that we want and this and that. But it doesn't, she doesn't get to see it. They make an offer. They and they go under contract, and the contract refers to it being turnkey, fully furnished, and they actually specified in it, they said all property remaining as of a certain date, January 10th, 2023, 2024, whatever, that's today's date. And that's all they did. They didn't really do the inventory list. They didn't do a separate personal property agreement. This was kind of it. And so fast forward a month or so, we are the week of closing, and the buyer, both the husband and the wife, show up for the final walkthrough. And the wife goes ballistic. She's like, wait a second. This is the first thing she sees when she walks in. That couch is different. The couch is different. Wait a second, what's going on here? And so she freaks out. They look at it and it blows up, completely blows up, because the buyer believes that there was a bait and switch. Now, I get involved at that point and I'm trying to figure out what happened. And the listing agents are like, wait a second, nothing weird went on here. It was just that that was the couch. The couch was from the MLS listing. That's the only thing the spouse saw. She saw this couch on the pictures that was on MLS. She was looking on Redfin or Zillow or Realtor.com. And that's all she knew. She didn't know what was actually there the day they did the initial walk through the house. So the husband probably dropped the ball, didn't really mention that there was a difference. He probably didn't even notice it. He just realized that she was upset, and it seemed like maybe the seller pulled a fast one. And it probably didn't have anything to do with the money. It had everything to do with, am I getting taken advantage? Am I getting played here? And that's a very dangerous thing, because, what we say behind closed doors when we're dealing with this sort of issue is, why are they being so ridiculous, right? This is just a painting. This is just a couch. This is just a rug. You can go down to Home Goods or Pottery Barn and get a new one. Why are we being so ridiculous? But it's so much more than that. It's indicative of, am I getting taken advantage of here? Is this a fast one? I'm already overpaying. Whatever it may be. I don't think I like this. This doesn't feel good. And that is dangerous. Now, in that story, I was able to talk to the buyer and say, look, I think the seller is right. It's, everyone, including your agent, is backing up the idea that this is the couch that was here when you saw it. and they did a terrible job of, you know, fixing this issue. They should never have left those pictures online for the wife to see or for anyone to see, because it puts it into dispute. But the buyer ended up having to just close and just really felt very sour about the deal, for right or for wrong. Even though he was my client, I had to give it to him straight and say, look, I think you messed up here. I think that what we should have done and what we did do allowed, you know, this gap, it allowed for everyone to kind of, you know, have a miscommunication. When we're young, we talk about the phone game, at least I did. The phone game is, you know, you have this line of kids, and the first one says something. It's supposed to be like a funny story or something, like I have a pink jacket with blue pants or something. I don't know. And then by the time it goes down the line, and everyone has to whisper it to the next person. By the time it goes to the end, the last person, they're like, oh, I'm not wearing any pants and my jacket's outside. Like, you know, it's a weird story. And some people, they mess it up on purpose. Other people just misheard it because it's being whispered. And other people don't know what the color pink is. So you can see it balloons, and it's a fun game, but I love to think about it because our job is to avoid that exact scenario happening in real life. That is our job 100%, is to communicate. And I've said this before as well, our contracts, they are 11, 15, 20 pages long, maybe more. And it's not because we want them to be. It's because we're trying to communicate. We're trying to do this efficiently in black and white. We're trying to be as clear as possible. And in turn, we tend to muddy the water, but that's what we're trying to do. It's pretty messy. So that is my historical reference for these inventory lists. And so fast forward since then, I've been a huge proponent of having a very tidied up inventory list in advance. I think that is absolutely the job of a listing agent prior to even going under contract, certainly prior to accepting an offer, is that you should have spent hours cataloging every item that's remaining. And in the event you don't want to catalog above and beyond, you know, the furniture and the accessories, if you didn't want to go and count the number of forks and detail the plates and look at all the linens, if you didn't want to have to do that, then you probably need to put some language in there saying the seller will make every accommodation to leave the remaining property, but is not obligated to do so. Something like that. I remember when I bought a house previously, the seller just told me, hey, look, you know, I've got all this stuff from 30 years. If I don't take it, you're welcome to have it. And he would allow me at the walkthrough to say yes or no, yes or no. And if I said no, he's going to take it down to the dump. That's great. I think that worked perfectly. It empowered the buyer. It empowered the seller. It empowered him to say, that's what I want. I want that. You know, and not even give me the option. So, Dad, you want to see if your video, if we can hear you now?
You can hear me. That I have two options to that.
All right,
Sometimes
cool.
they don't want to spend all day counting spoons, to put it bluntly. One is turnkey furnish as viewed on such and such a date, and take a video, so you can document it to some extent. And that works as long as it's a place that the seller hasn't lived in, where you don't have a lot of personal stuff, you know, pictures of your children and your own clothes and the bureaus and things like that.
So what is your suggestion, to take a video?
You take a video, but it's turnkey furnished as of such and such a date, where the people viewed the property. So that's one way to make it a little less risky. Another method is turnkey furnished as of such and such a date minus, and there's a clause on page 1 where you can separate out certain things.
Yeah.
And you list the big things that mean something to the seller, and you include an additional term, and including personal items. So it's sort of a catch. So you got your option, which is list everything, which, you know, some people just don't want to do it.
Yeah.
The second one is as viewed on such and such a date, and take a video of it, so you know what you can, which I've run into. Or the third option, turnkey furnished as viewed on such and such a date. Page one, the things you're excluding, the big stuff, and add to the big stuff, like, the kids' photos and all that, all personal items. So I'm not selling my clothes if it's my home.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important because with Nabor, if you look at the tangible property that's included in a transaction, it could theoretically include my stereo, Christian.
Yeah, we
Home
can't have
entertainment
that
system.
unless I'm the buyer, right?
Well, unless you're the buyer, but there's a lot of stuff in those first 13 lines that people might not want to convey. So you need to go over that as well.
Yeah, so I'm sharing my screen. This is inventory of personal property. This is the Nabor form. You're welcome to use this, or there are other forms available. But
Mm.
this is something that the seller should do ahead of closing, I mean, ahead of listing the property, or during their listing and before you actually go into some sort of contract. They should go through this line by line. And it sounds like a ton of work, and it is. It's a lot of work, absolutely. But it's very important because, and I'll tell you the story that we're going through at the moment, and I'll explain kind of where the issues are. I'll give you the more recent update to this issue and why I felt compelled to talk about it today. But here was something that I thought was interesting. You have all this included stuff. It goes into real detail. I mean, even has mugs, glasses, platters, and it really is supposed to give an approximate number. If I'm the seller, I should probably downplay the number. If I think I have 30 mugs, I'll probably put 20. And that way, if I break a couple, it doesn't really matter. And hopefully the buyer, we have to convince the buyer, look, it's mugs. Let's not worry about it. But this is what, if you really want to be particular and you want to give your client the best chance to be happy, go through this with them, have them do it, give them a job to do. Hey, look, this is what we need. This part I think is really important. So you can itemize additional items, but then the exclusions. This part's huge. The exclusions need to be specific to the big items. Now, Dad, there are a couple ways you can deal with this, right? The thing that I've really enjoyed the most is that if there's something you don't want to sell, it shouldn't be there, right? We just like not have it there. I mean, unless it's like the bed, right? We could put the bed as an exclusion. You need it to sleep on. But if you really love the paintings, take them down, remove them. What do you think of that, Dad?
Where would you put? I mean, look at my house. I mean, I bought it for my folks. I got stuff from my grandfather. I got stuff from my grandmother. I got stuff from my parents. I have no place to put all that stuff.
Well, I think it's a
Except,
question, right? If
yeah.
so, that could be the answer, Dad, that, hey, look, I have nowhere to go. At least as the realtor, you've suggested it. You've said, hey, look, this can be problematic. If we show it and a buyer loves it, they're going to want it. So I would, generally the best solution is to remove it before we actually list it. Then let's look at the other options. If Dad, if you're going to fight me on that, I'm going to look, all right, here's some other options. But
No,
most of our clients,
but you want to
they're
have.
going back home to Michigan, they're going back home to New Jersey, and or they're going into a
Right.
smaller home. They probably do have a place that they could put a handful of items. They could get a storage unit for a month while they're cleaning out the place. In fact, that might be a lot of realtors' suggestions when you go to list is to declutter, to take stuff away and make it clean, make it feel open. I think you use this as a strategy to kind of force your client or convince your client to agree to do this stuff. All right, we got to clean up, and hey, here's one of the reasons we want to clean up is that we don't want the buyer to see all your nice stuff. You don't want to show them all that. They'd want it, even if you really are just trying to declutter. So
Another option, Chris, would be instead of turnkey, would be all furniture located on the premises on such a date. So you're limiting it to furniture and not the stuff on the walls or the
yeah,
pans or the plates.
and Dad, I don't know if you were on the video when I was talking about the date issue. I'm
Yeah.
curious what you think of this. I had a client that they mentioned a date and then they didn't really have anything to back it up with. and it caused
Uh,
this massive problem. It's like, well, what you think the date was and what was there is different than what I think was there on that date. And it didn't match the MLS pictures. So there was this natural conflict where it's like, I don't know how to prove it. So the date thing has its own flaws as well.
owners of the two or the four. But again, it's different if it's your home versus a second home, which you can just, it's all rooms to go stuff. You don't have a lot of family photos. You don't have things that came down from your grandparents in it. Those things are a little better. But your early like being played, we forget this is extremely emotional for folks. And little things which I've had, like a 6 foot bird cage almost blew $1 million deal. A bronze sculpture on the wall, which is probably worth a couple $100, almost blew another more than $1 million deal. They're emotional. They don't like looking stupid. If you can keep your people calm and put it in context, you can smooth over that.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you notice this part, Dad? And this was something that came up as an issue on a current deal. Any personal property item not listed above or in the sales contract is deemed to be excluded. And that makes sense, right? You're like,
Right.
we're not talking about, the problem is when you reference it as turnkey or see inventory list on page 1, and then you have this language in here and you're like, all right, they're kind of saying different things potentially. Because I've heard a lot of people believe turnkey means everything, right? It's everything goes, except for
Yeah.
this small list of exclusions. But it really isn't that. It's like, no, everything minus these exclusions. And again, that goes back to my idea of like, if you don't want to sell it, it shouldn't be there. That
And
part
my
came
my
up
my
recently.
go-to move, Christian, has always been go with the shortest list, whatever it is. Uh, Conveying, you list those. Sellers conveying this short list of stuff. If the things you're excluding is the shortest list, the seller furnish minus these things.
Yep,
Whatever list, anything that facilitate communication and the impression that nobody's trying to be clever and take something that's important to somebody, and warn your buyer to have a little sympathy, because they might have inadvertently left something in that was, if there's an emotional attachment to it, it reminds them of family.
absolutely. So we had this deal come up, and here I'll give you kind of the short and sweet on it. It's an expensive property. The furniture is being bought together with the sales price, and they agreed to do an inventory list. They had 7 days to agree to it after going under contract. So they used the personal property addendum that gives the buyer and seller 7 days to come to an agreement. If either party is unhappy, they can each terminate and buyer would get their deposit back.
Right.
Again, I don't like that form because it gives either buyer or seller ability to get out, which makes it really tenuous. And now you're really doing all this work and emotions. And like, I think, again, spend the time on the inventory list before you accept an offer like that so that there isn't these 7 days to go back and forth. Maybe that's a good learning lesson of like, in the very least, don't do this personal property addendum that gives people so much more time. It's like a double-edged sword. It's kind of brutal.
I don't like it at all, because it gives people an opportunity to get out. They can manipulate it and be deliberately difficult to get out of the deal.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And that's kind of what happened. So we had this deal, buyer and seller, they spend a couple of days doing an inventory list. The seller puts it together, the buyer looks at it, signs it, and then it goes back to the seller who then adds a couple more things. They both sign it. This is like day 3, day 4.
right.
So they both sign it. It's done. Inventory list is done. And then the seller keeps taking more. She keeps taking more, and the buyer's getting upset, and then the buyer's getting emotional. Now the seller's emotional. They feel like they're fighting. The agents are at each other because this is not easy. Now everyone's getting very stressed. So now they feel like they're getting pulled into it and feel like they're being targeted in a sense. And so they have their guard up a bit. And so I got involved and I called the listing agent and said, all right, how do we save this? But it seems that buyer and seller are both getting really upset with each other. What's the deal? What's going on? Please tell me. And I just tried to be the good guy. Hey, the buyer's being
Right.
crazy. What does the seller really want? And obviously I'm talking to the buyer. I'm like, oh yeah, the seller's being crazy. What do you really want? And I'm just trying to figure out where everyone lies. And so I actually, the listing agent, she's like, "Oh yeah, this is crazy, and I don't know why everyone isn't on the same page." And then I realized, and I said, you and I are not on the same page either. I said, your definition of turnkey is very different than mine or someone else's. I said, we need to resolve this. So this is what I suggested, and this is after everything had been building up and everything had kind of gotten a little ugly, or at least stressful, not ugly. I would say to the agent's compliment, they've kept it from getting ugly. They've kept emotions as low as possible. And that's saying something, actually. But I said to the listing agent, sit down with your seller and say, one last time, what are you taking? Because everything else has to stay. I
Yeah.
said, that's how blunt it needs to be. I need to know, what is the seller taking? Everything else stays. And we're basically changing the language. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the language that I drafted. I'm not saying it's the greatest language in the world, but I just texted it to everybody. And it says the property is being sold together with all personal property, including furniture, accessories, and necessities such as plates and linens. The inventory list, that's a capitalized inventory list, incorporated herein, references the most important of these items, minus specific exclusions that are meaningful to the seller. All other items shall remain after closing. I think that is better language than turnkey. And I had to learn that the hard way. What do you think, Dad? Have
Point
you used
out
language like
to
that?
my, I have,
Um,
but
but
back to your motion again. I try to point out to the parties that throughout Florida, for example, we use the FAR bar contract, the washer and dryer aren't included. And in different parts of the country, we have different form contracts where it might be customary that certain things are included or not included. So when we get a situation, which is quite common, that the washer and dryer is on the moving truck when the buyer does his walkthrough and the buyer's levitating, I try to calm the buyer down by saying, well, if you go to Jacksonville and they're using FAR, that wouldn't be included anyways. And the seller wasn't trying to take advantage of you. He just in good faith thought that's what was not excluded.
yeah, didn't read the contract.
Well, I mean, you're just pointing out it wasn't on purpose. So you take
Yeah,
that whole element of being played out of it. He's
right.
not trying to be a bad guy. It was an honest, for goodness mistake. And sometimes a $200 credit or a $400 credit will fix it. Once they figure out, it's just that they have different customs wherever they're from. And again, I point out how Florida differs from area to area.
Yeah.
It's on the moving truck. What the heck are we going to do? We can't, turn it around.
Yeah, we have within Florida it's different, but we have a funny saying here in the office. It's like, well, in Michigan, it's like, yeah, everyone wants to say the way they're used to because that's how they
Yeah,
understand it.
but that's the point. You don't have homogeneity throughout the country. It's
Yeah, we
different
don't.
in all over the place, and it could be no bad for
Yeah, so we
people
have a
or
couple of people that have
sentimental color.
commented in the chats. One, Vicky mentions, I always thought dishes, linens, towels, silverware, and all furniture, as well as accessories, unless they were excluded. Vicky, that's probably what I would have guessed. However, I'm pretty rational and low key. If the seller ends up taking the silverware, oh, bummer. I thought that was included. All right, whatever. But some buyers aren't quite like that. Some buyers are like, wait a second, half the silverware is missing. This is unacceptable. I'm being played. So you just have to be careful. That whole assumption or assuming what the agreement was, that's what I'm fearing is getting us in trouble with my current deal. Someone else said a
The better the
potential.
the better you are. Really.
Yeah, the potential of any forms of advertising, including MLS photos, can mislead potential customers. Deb, you nailed it. MLS contractually can almost be ignored once you go under contract. Everything from that is now kind of merged into your contract. And if your contract just says turnkey or all items, or all items is probably better than turnkey. Maybe we've learned that. But I think you specifically say all items remaining on the property, including but not limited to blankety blankety blank. And then there's a separate line on page 1 for specific exclusions. I'm taking my refrigerator because I like it that much.
Well,
Deb,
actually, that's really,
I'm gonna
sorry,
ask you this question. If you can remember like the weirdest thing someone wanted to exclude from a sale.
a
I
six,
had one, it
a
was
6 foot
front
bird
door.
cage.
What'd you say?
It was a 6 foot bird cage, and it was supposedly a personal item.
Yeah. Yeah, that should be
So how
excluded.
the hell is a bird cage a personal item?
Yeah.
6 foot.
Um, and what I want to make sure I talk to this topic before we get off of that, but this can cut both ways. You could have a seller who wanted to give a bunch of junk to the buyer, and the buyer didn't want it, right? So I've had closings where the seller left all the paint. I'm sure all of you have had this. Culturally, it's a pretty nice thing to do in most areas. But my buyer was from out of the country. I think they were from England. And they're like, what am I going to do with all this paint? This is awful. And they got really angry.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it cuts both ways. So as the buyer representative, not only do you want to say all furniture and all accessories, you kind of want to ask them, is there anything you don't want to be left? And to that point, I actually had a closing, drafting a contract for them today, and they said, the buyer was specific, and they said, please make sure that the contract states that all the window treatments shall be removed throughout the entire house. I'm like, okay, we can add that in. They say, except for the wood paneled, shutters. Okay, let's add that back in. So I put in wood shutters in the kitchen and lanai, or kitchen and laundry room shall remain. All other window treatments shall be removed prior to closing.
I
So
mean,
we
it's
put that in
really
other
fun.
terms and
But
conditions.
sometimes I get buyers who don't like all the seller's furniture. They think it's ugly and they want to buy new furniture. And because of the way the negotiation was going, I would tell them, well, don't tell the seller you hate their stuff or their taste is terrible in your opinion.
Yeah, that's
Just, oh, isn't it
challenging.
beautiful? Isn't this wonderful? We love it. Then you donate it to some consignment shop
Love it.
afterwards, the battered women's shelter, something like that.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, that's great. I've actually got some really great feedback from people, so thank you for sending this in. Rebecca, her and I actually had a deal, and we talked about it prior to going, I think prior to going live on the listing, and I said, Rebecca, we're having problems with this, and I gave her the couch example, and so
yeah.
she spent hours putting together an inventory list. The seller refused to sign it. And I think she's still a little bitter about it. And so what I told her is I said, you still did the right thing. You have an inventory list. And now if this becomes a problem because the seller refuses to sign it, you can at least go back to him and say, that's why I did the inventory list. You were wrong. In the very least, it allows for better communication between you and your client to say, this is what I'm understanding that you want. I understand you don't want to sign it, but between you and I, are we good? Is this okay?
Yeah, yeah.
That
You
one
know,
was an interesting one. I think he was worried about liability. He was worried that he couldn't take more things. And it was like, yeah, that's kind of exactly the point. We're
yeah,
trying to hold you to your word.
yeah. I mean,
So,
I use the analogy that the furniture tends to be like a couple going through divorce and agree on
yeah,
who gets
the
the.
divorce is a great one. Actually, even better is if it's someone who's recently passed. It
Right.
sounds silly me saying that, but if someone has recently passed and
Yeah,
the estate goes to sell the property, what I've seen time and time again is like the sister comes in for one last stay in the condo and she takes the whole bedroom set.
yeah,
They're going through the drawers and they take mom's peeler and the cutting board, and it's like, wait, that is not what we agreed to. that's a risk if you're a listing agent. So just be aware that that happens.
Sometimes it's tough that
Denise
the
had
daughter might have given to the mother, say. Because I did that with my own parents. I took stuff back that I gave to them as gifts.
prior to going under contract, I hope. I didn't get that phone
Yes.
call.
Yeah, we had a good contract.
So Denise makes a great example. You can move it to a spare bedroom and exclude anything in that room. I love that idea. Maybe it makes it harder to show how big the bedroom is. I think that's a genius idea to clean things up and make it easy for you. Vicky mentioned, I always ask sellers to remove any items that are not included. If it is a light fixture, I suggest they replace it with one they can leave. What about taking pictures and saying all is viewed on the showing date, if all included? Also, how do you suggest handling value on a finance deal? All great points, Vicky. I've used these before. I was going to
Sometimes
say,
the mirror in the bathroom.
yeah, mirror in the bathroom. The seller took it. They meant something to them. The buyer refused to close unless they brought it back and then tore the house
Yeah.
down, like, just to
Yeah.
spite the seller. It's just brutal. The funniest one I had was a front door. So the front door was an antique, had been passed down from generation to generation, but the house was only 2 years old. That one actually had two issues. If they had left the door, they would have had to do a lead-based paint disclosure, which is interesting. And they also would have had to convince the buyer that no, 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 the door stays, or the door comes. So we recommended that they just replace the door prior to going under contract. That was a fun one. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, you do that at 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah. Taking pictures is what I suggested on this most recent deal. And the funny thing on that was that the seller still refused to sign off on it. She was afraid that it wasn't going to, there's going to be too much work to go through each item and say what was included and not. It's like, man, I feel like we're beating our head against the wall. This is brutal. And then finally, Vicky asked, if all included, how do you suggest handling the value on a finance deal? Dad, you and I have talked about this a lot. We always recommend you have
Thanks.
separate consideration, right?
And we have a form for that. So you don't want any furniture on a contract if they're getting financed.
They're getting a mortgage. It
And
has to be
theoretically,
separate. So what we do is we do a personal property agreement. It's totally separate from the sales
right.
contract. And you put a number to it. Vicky, it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but it should be pretty close with what the buyer and seller think it's worth. Ultimately, let's say you're buying the whole thing for 500,000, but there's $10,000 worth of furniture, then really your sale price is 490, and you have a separate personal property agreement for 10,000. So collectively it's 500. It reduces the risk that it won't appraise. It does a lot of things, but it also keeps you in compliance with mortgage laws. So Deb also follows
For
up
your
after
listing,
we went through all of this. Deb says, perhaps we should not use adjectives such as turnkey in lieu of specific terms. That's what I learned. That's what I learned. Turnkey is not
yeah.
what I thought it meant. I'll take the blame on that one. I thought it meant everything, and it doesn't necessarily mean that.
Oh, that's like the word reasonable.
Well, I'm reasonable, you're not, so that's true, right?
Yeah. Well, too bad.
I think that's probably enough for today. I really did want to get into some other topics, but we'll save that. And I think that the more
Thank
you
you,
keep those
Christian.
coming, the more we'll do them. So we'll do that. We've got coming up in the future buyer election forms, backup offers, permitting has been a big issue, and I think it will continue to be so. So I would love to continue to hear from you guys, and looking forward to helping. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.